Imagine you are walking into a luxurious mansion where crystal chandeliers sparkle like stars, illuminating the pure white marble walls. Classical music plays softly, blending with the laughter of the upper-class guests in gorgeous evening gowns and expensive suits. This is a luxurious party, the kind that only the richest and most powerful are invited to. But in the midst of this perfect setting, there is someone who seems to not belong here. A black woman, about 40 years old, wearing a simple maid's uniform, quietly carrying a tray of drinks through the crowd. She moves deftly, her eyes downcast, trying not to disturb anyone. But then, a cold voice rings out, cutting through the warm atmosphere like a sharp knife. "What are you doing here?" The speaker is a tall, middle-aged man with well-groomed hair and a shiny black suit. He was Richard Bennett, a prominent real estate developer who had called himself the host of the party. He stood in the middle of the crowd, a glass of wine in his hand, his eyes cold as he looked at the maid. She paused, the tray of drinks shaking slightly in her hand, but she did not answer immediately. "I ask again," Richard said loudly, his tone full of contempt. "Who gave you permission to come in here? This is not a place for someone like you." The crowd began to murmur. A few people snickered, but no one spoke up to intervene. The woman, named Evelyn, raised her head, her eyes calm but with an unreadable glint. "I am just doing my job, sir," she said, her voice low but clear. Richard laughed, a dry, arrogant laugh. "Your job? You think you deserve to stand among the likes of us? Look at you, dirty and low. Get out of here now, before I call security." The words hit Evelyn like a slap in the face, and you could feel the injustice welling up inside you. She had done nothing wrong, simply serving drinks as her job, but Richard was treating her like she was an intruder. The surrounding customers began to look at Evelyn with questioning eyes, some even stepping back as if she was carrying something unclean. Evelyn stood there, her tray still in her hand, but you could see her hands clench tighter, as if she was holding back a deep anger. The situation became even more tense when Richard stepped closer, snatched the tray from Evelyn's hands, and slammed it down on the table, causing several glasses of wine to spill out, staining the white tablecloth red. "I told you, go away," he shouted, pointing at the door. "You don't belong here, and you never will." The crowd was silent now, but not because they felt it was unfair. They were silent because they were curious, because they wanted to see what would happen next. Evelyn did not argue, did not raise her voice, just bowed her head, put her apron down on the table, and walked out of the banquet hall. But as she passed Richard, she stopped for a second, looked him straight in the eye, and said one single sentence, her voice low and meaningful. "You will regret this, I promise you. The words were like a stone thrown into a still pond, and Richard paused for a second, but then he burst out laughing, as if it were the funniest thing he had ever heard. "Regret? A maid like you dares to speak to me like that? Who do you think you are?" Evelyn didn't reply, just kept walking, her demeanor not one of defeat. It was one of someone who knew she held a secret that no one in the room could imagine. As the door closed behind her, Richard turned back to the crowd, raised his glass, and laughed. "See, I told you. People like her never belong in our world." The guests laughed along, sipping their wine again, as if it were all over. But you could feel that this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of something bigger, something that would surprise everyone in the room. You could feel the curiosity rising in your heart. Who was this woman? Why was she so calm in the face of such public humiliation? And what did her last words, "You will regret this," mean? As Richard continued to brag to his guests about his wealth and power, you couldn't help but feel that he had just signed his own death warrant. There was something in Evelyn's eyes, in the way she left that made you believe that there was more to this story. And you were right, because what was about to happen would turn the entire party upside down. The party continued. The chandeliers still glittered, and the laughter of the high-class guests still echoed in the lavish space of the mansion. Richard Bennett, with a glass of wine in his hand, was telling a story about his latest real estate deal, boasting that he had just bought this very mansion for tens of millions of dollars. "This is a symbol of success," he said, his voice full of pride. "Only those who are worthy may enter here, and I am proud to be its owner." The crowd applauded, but at that moment, the door to the banquet hall swung open, and a man in a gray suit, looking professional, entered with a thick file in his hand. He was the personal lawyer of the family that owned the mansion, and there was no trace of joy on his face. "Sorry to interrupt," the lawyer said, his voice low and stern, "but I need to clear something up right now." The room fell silent, all eyes on him. Richard frowned, put down his glass, and his tone was tinged with annoyance. "What is so important that you have to interrupt my party?" The lawyer did not reply immediately, but turned to look at the door where Evelyn had just entered again. But this time, she was no longer wearing her maid's uniform. She wore a deep blue evening gown, tight-fitting and elegant, showing off her power and grace. The crowd murmured, and Richard stood still, his face pale as if he had seen a ghost. "Let me introduce you," the lawyer said, his voice clear in the silence. "This is Evelyn Carter, the true owner of this mansion, and the woman behind Carter Holdings, one of the largest real estate companies in the area." The room exploded in shocked whispers. Richard took a step back, his mouth hanging open, but no words coming out. Evelyn stepped forward, her eyes sharp but calm, looking straight at Richard. "You're right, Mr. Bennett," she said, her voice low but authoritative. "Not everyone belongs here, and I'm afraid you don't." You could feel the atmosphere in the room change. The guests, who had been laughing at Evelyn, were now looking at her with a mixture of shock and fear. Richard stammered, trying to find words to justify himself. But I bought the house. I have a contract." The lawyer held up the documents, shaking his head. "Your contract is fake. You were tricked by a ghost brokerage firm. The house was never put up for sale. Mrs. Carter only authorized this party as part of a test, to see what kind of person you really are." Richard nearly collapsed, sweat pouring from his forehead. He had just realized that he had lost not only the house, but his reputation. Evelyn didn't stop there. She stepped closer to Richard, her voice no longer that of a resigned maid, but that of a woman in control. "I disguised myself as a maid to see how you would treat those around you," she said. "And you failed miserably. Not only did you discriminate against me, you humiliated me in front of everyone. Now I want you to leave. Now." The crowd was silent, no one daring to speak. Richard tried to open his mouth, but Evelyn raised her hand to stop him. "Don't say anything. You've said enough. Security," she called, and two tall guards stepped in, approaching Richard. He had no choice but to leave, head bowed, eyes full of regret and humiliation. As Richard was led out, Evelyn turned back to the crowd, her gaze softening, but still authoritative. "I'm not throwing this party to flaunt wealth," she said, "but to remind us all that true power lies not in money or status. It's in how we treat others. I hope you'll remember that." The room applauded, but this time it was genuine respect, not false flattery. Evelyn smiled slightly, then walked out of the banquet hall, leaving the crowd to their own thoughts. But her story wasn't over, and what happened next would leave everyone pondering the meaning of justice. The next day, news of the incident at the mansion spread like wildfire across the city. Major newspapers ran headlines, Real estate agent exposed at lavish party. Real owner is humiliated Maid. Richard Bennett, once considered the king of real estate, was now a laughingstock in the eyes of everyone. The fake contract he signed not only cost him tens of millions of dollars, but also led to a series of lawsuits from partners and customers who felt cheated by his arrogance. His company quickly collapsed, and the reputation he had built over 20 years was destroyed overnight. Meanwhile, Evelyn Carter became a symbol of justice and humility. She appeared on a popular television show where she told her story with sincerity and strength. "I grew up poor," she said, "and I know what it feels like to be looked down upon. But I worked hard, built my company from scratch, and I always believed that a person's worth is not in the color of their skin or their status. It's in their heart." The quote resonated with millions of viewers, and she soon received thousands of letters of thanks from people who had been discriminated against, thanking her for standing up. But Evelyn didn't stop there. She decided to turn the mansion, once a symbol of luxury and arrogance, into a community center where poor children could come to learn and grow. "I didn't want this to be just a beautiful building," she said at the center's inauguration. "I wanted it to be a place where dreams are nurtured, where everyone is treated equally, no matter who they are." The center quickly became a highlight in the area, attracting the attention of donors and charities. Evelyn visited regularly, teaching life skills classes herself, and every time she saw the smiles on the children's faces, she knew she had done the right thing. Meanwhile, Richard Bennett faced the long-term consequences of his actions. After his company went bankrupt, he moved to a small town, living a quiet life, far from the limelight he had once craved. But wherever he hid, the story of his humiliation at the party was told as a warning. His former friends now avoided him, and his family endured the scrutiny of neighbors. He didn't just lose money, he lost his reputation, something he had valued more than anything. One time, an old acquaintance met him at a coffee shop and asked, "Do you regret it?" Richard just bowed his head and whispered, "I was wrong. I never thought she would be like that." Evelyn's story is not just about revenge. It's about proving that justice always finds its way. Late one afternoon, she stood on the balcony of the community center, looking out over the garden where the children were playing. The setting sun shone on her face, highlighting her gentle but determined smile. She thought about the hard times, about the time she was taken for granted, and about the moment she stood up for justice. She didn't just take back what was hers, she created a legacy of equality and hope. And when you think about this story, you can't help but wonder what would happen if we all treated others with respect, no matter who they were. If we didn't let prejudice blind us? Evelyn taught us that justice isn't just about punishing wrongdoers, it's about building a better world. And when you turn off this video, remember what she proved. No one can take away your worth unless you let them. Live like Evelyn, strong, humble, and always true.